Keanu had turned the cabin into something more now. Construction workers came by to help build small lodges nearby, following the sketches Sandra had drawn on napkins. They called it For Always, just like they had planned. It wasn't finished yet, but the dream was alive, and that was enough for him. One quiet evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Sandra called out to him from the porch. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Come sit with me." He walked over and sat beside her. She was wearing a white shawl, her hair falling gently around her face, her skin pale but glowing in the golden light. She looked peaceful, too peaceful. "You know," she said, "I used to think I needed big moments to feel alive. Movie premieres, awards, bright lights. But now I think this is all I ever wanted. The quiet, the real, the honest." Keanu nodded, smiling faintly. "The world out there is loud, but this is what matters." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You gave me something real." He looked at her, his eyes heavy with emotion. "No," he said softly. "You gave it to me first. I just learned how to hold on to it." They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. For a long while, neither of them spoke. It was enough just to be there. But as night fell, Sandra turned to him, her hand trembling slightly. "Keanu," she said, "there's one last thing I want to give you." He frowned gently. "You've given me enough," she smiled. "Not yet." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, old and worn. "I wrote this before I came here. I didn't know if I'd ever be brave enough to give it to you. But now I think I am." He hesitated. "What is it?" "A letter," she said softly. "For when I can't be here to tell you what I feel." His eyes filled with tears. "Don't talk like that. Promise me you'll read it," she said firmly, pressing it into his hand. "Not now. Later, when the cherry blossoms bloom again." He looked at the letter, then at her, shaking his head. "I can't think about that day," she smiled faintly. "Then don't. Just promise me you'll read it when the time comes." He nodded slowly. "I promise." That night he helped her to bed. She fell asleep holding his hand, her breathing slow but steady. He sat beside her, watching over her until the first light of dawn. And as the sun rose, something deep inside him told him that this morning would be different. When he looked at her, she was still, peaceful, serene, her face calm as if she had simply drifted into another dream. She was gone, but in the softest way possible, like a whisper fading into the wind. Keanu didn't cry right away. He just sat there holding her hand, unable to move. Outside, the cherry blossom tree was in full bloom again, its petals falling gently through the morning light. It was as if the world had chosen this exact moment to honor her. Weeks later, after the retreat was completed, Keanu stood under that same tree. Dozens of people had gathered, friends, colleagues, artists, strangers who had been touched by Sandra's kindness. They didn't talk about fame or movies or success. They talked about her heart, her generosity, her grace. After everyone left, Keanu stayed behind, holding the unopened letter. He had kept his promise. The blossoms were back and it was time. He sat on the grass, opened the envelope carefully and began to read. The letter was written in her familiar handwriting. Neat, calm, gentle. "Dear Keanu, if you're reading this, it means the blossoms have returned. I hope they're beautiful this year. I hope you're smiling when you see them. I wanted to thank you, not for the gift, but for the peace you brought into my life. I used to think love had to be loud to be real, but you showed me that the quiet kind, the patient kind, the one that asks for nothing, that's the one that lasts. Don't mourn me too long. Promise me you'll laugh again, that you'll ride your motorcycle down the coast, that you'll keep building for always. Fill it with music, art, stories, and kindness. The things that remind people that love doesn't end when a person does. And when you look at the blossoms each year, don't think of me as gone. Think of me as the wind that moves through them, still here, still grateful, still smiling. For always." Sandra Keanu folded the letter carefully, tears slipping down his face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were full of warmth, of gratitude. He looked up at the cherry blossom tree, its petals dancing in the breeze, and whispered, "For always." As years went by, the retreat became a sanctuary for people around the world. Writers came to find words again. Painters came to rediscover color. And those who had lost someone came to heal. And at the center of it all stood that single cherry blossom tree, the tree that began with a promise and grew into a legacy. Every spring, Keanu returned to that spot with a single white flower in his hand. He would smile at the sky and say, "We kept our promise, Sandra." And somewhere in the hush of the wind through the blossoms, it always felt like she smiled back. The Forgotten Promise, the story begins on a quiet December morning in Los Angeles. The winter air is still, the streets are calm, and a gentle sun tries to break through the cold mist. Keanu Reeves sits alone in a small cafe near Sunset Boulevard, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. He isn't there for fame or company or to escape the noise of Hollywood. He is there because this cafe once held a memory he never shared with anyone. Years ago, he and Sandra Bullock sat at this very table. It was after the filming of Speed. They had both been young, uncertain, and quietly in awe of each other. Fame was new, life was fast, and yet in that one afternoon, time had slowed down. She had smiled, looked at him across the steaming mugs, and said softly, "One day, we'll give each other a gift that means something real. Not money, not gold. Something that stays." He had laughed then, brushing it off as another promise lost to time. But now, decades later, that line echoed like an unfinished song. And today, for reasons even he couldn't explain, he couldn't stop thinking about it. As he stared out the window, his phone buzzed. A message appeared from a name he hadn't seen in months. Sandra. It was simple. "Heard you're in L.A. Can we talk?" He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering above the screen. The last time they had spoken was brief, polite, and distant. Two old friends pretending time hadn't created space between them. He replied with one word. Always. Later that afternoon, they met in a quiet park hidden behind a row of eucalyptus trees. She looked the same, calm, radiant, and grounded, yet her eyes carried something heavy, something unspoken. She hugged him like she hadn't seen him in years, and maybe that was true. "You still keep your promises?" she asked, half smiling. He raised an eyebrow. "Depends on which one." She looked away, her tone softening. "The one from the cafe. About a gift that means something real." He froze for a second, caught between nostalgia and confusion. "You remember that?" "I never forgot," she said quietly. "Maybe because I never got the chance to give mine." They sat on a wooden bench under the weak afternoon sun. Sandra's hands trembled slightly, and Keanu noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Keanu," she began slowly, "I found out something personal. I didn't want to tell anyone, but I couldn't keep it from you." His heart tightened. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "I'm sick. It's not fatal yet, but it changes things. It makes you think differently about time, about what really matters." Keanu stared at her, words failing him. His throat burned as he tried to respond, but nothing came out. She continued, forcing a smile. "Don't look at me like that. I'm fine, just figuring things out. And when I thought about what I haven't done, I realized I still owed you that gift." Keanu finally spoke, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," she whispered, "but I owe myself the truth. And I owe you honesty." The silence stretched between them. In that moment, he saw her not as the star the world admired, but as the friend who had once shared quiet dreams over cheap coffee and laughter that lasted long after they left the cafe. "Then let me give you mine first," he said softly. "I've been holding on to it for years." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. It was old, slightly worn, but beautifully carved. She looked surprised. "You carried this around?" "Everywhere," he said. "It's not much, but it's something real." She opened it carefully. Inside was a small silver key and a folded note. Her eyes filled with confusion and emotion at once. "What's this?" "A key," he said with a faint smile. "To something that belongs to both of us." She unfolded the note and read it silently. Her lips trembled as she whispered the words aloud. "For the day when words aren't enough. Meet me where it all began. She looked up. The cafe? He nodded slowly. But not today. When you're ready. The wind blew softly, scattering yellow leaves across the path. She stared at the key in her hand, unsure whether to laugh or cry. You always did like mysteries, she said, smiling through tears. Only the kind worth solving, he replied, as they sat there. Neither of them realized that this small key would open not just a door, but an entire chapter of their lives they thought had closed forever. And somewhere deep down, Sandra knew that whatever came next would change everything between them. The key and the silence. 3 days passed after their meeting in the park. Keanu stayed quiet, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what to say. The image of Sandra's trembling hands, her soft voice, and the way she looked at that small silver key kept haunting him. He couldn't stop replaying it all in his mind. On the 4th morning, he received another message from her. I'm ready. That was all it said. No details, no location, just those 2 words. But he knew exactly what it meant. He got into his old motorcycle and rode toward the small cafe where it had all begun. The sky was overcast, the roads still wet from last night's rain. He could feel the cold air biting his face, but it didn't matter. He wasn't thinking about comfort. He was thinking about her. When he reached the cafe, she was already there, sitting by the window just like before. A scarf wrapped around her neck, hair loose, eyes focused on the key she held in her hand. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled. It wasn't the bright movie star smile the world knew. It was soft, tired, but peaceful. You came, she said as he took the seat opposite her. I said I would, he replied simply. For a while, they just sat there in silence. The sound of rain dripping from the roof and the faint music playing inside filled the quiet space. Finally, she spoke. So, she said, placing the key on the table, what does this open? He reached into his pocket and placed a small folded piece of paper next to it. A place, he said. One I never showed anyone. She picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was an address written in his familiar handwriting. Her brows furrowed as she read it aloud. This is outside the city. What's there? You'll see, he said with a faint smile. An hour later, they were driving through the hills on the edge of Los Angeles. The car windows were half open, letting the wind play through their hair. Sandra turned to him and asked quietly, Why did you wait all these years? He kept his eyes on the road. Because I didn't know what to give you. And maybe because I wasn't ready to face what it would mean. And what does it mean? She asked softly. He paused before answering. It means this was never just about a gift. She looked out the window, her heart heavy, but curious. Then what was it about? He smiled faintly. You'll understand soon. They arrived at an old cabin hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't luxurious, but it had warmth. Smoke rose from the chimney. The porch creaked gently, and the smell of pine filled the air. You built this? She asked, stepping out of the car. He nodded. A long time ago. I used to come here to think, to escape. To remember. To remember what? Peace, he said simply. Inside the cabin, everything was neat and quiet. There were books stacked by the fireplace, a few old photos on the mantel, and a single piano near the window. She walked over to it and touched the keys gently. You play? She asked. Sometimes, he said. When words aren't enough, she pressed a single note, soft, trembling, and smiled. Then maybe that's what this key was for. Not to open a door, but to open this moment. Keanu looked at her, his expression serious but kind. You're not wrong, but there's more. He went to a small drawer and pulled out a box, larger than the first one. He handed it to her. This is your part of the promise. She hesitated before opening it. Inside there was an old photograph, one from the set of Speed. It was a candid shot, both of them laughing at something out of frame. Behind the photo was a small envelope. She opened it, and inside was a letter written in her own handwriting. Her eyes widened. How did you get this? You left it in my trailer after filming, he said quietly. I found it years later. I never told you because I didn't think you'd want me to read it. Her hands shook slightly. And did you? He nodded slowly. I did, she exhaled, trying to hold back tears. I was so young then. I didn't even know what I was feeling. You wrote, he said, that sometimes the people we connect with most deeply aren't the ones we end up with, but the ones who remind us who we are. She nodded, tears welling up. And I meant every word. So did I, he said softly. The air between them grew heavy. The rain outside grew louder, as if echoing every unspoken thought they had carried for years. Finally, she asked, "So what now?" He looked out the window and said, "Now we make it real. Not just a promise. Not just a memory." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," he said again, standing up and walking toward the door. "Come with me." Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. He led her to a small garden behind the cabin. At its center stood an old wooden box buried halfway in the soil. He knelt down, dug around it, and lifted it free. "What is that?" she asked. "Something I buried the day we wrapped our first film," he said. "I told myself I'd only open it when it mattered most." He brushed off the dirt and opened the box. Inside were a few old letters, a movie ticket, and a single ring. Not gold, not diamond, but simple, engraved with 2 words, "For always." Sandra stared at it, speechless. "It's not what you think," he said gently. "It's not a proposal. It's a reminder that no matter where life takes us, the kindness, the respect, the friendship, it lasts." She looked at him for a long moment, tears falling freely now. "You kept all this," she whispered, "because it mattered," he said. In that quiet garden, surrounded by rain and memory, they stood together, 2 souls who had never really said goodbye. And for the first time in years, neither of them needed to. The letter that changed everything. The next morning, the air outside the cabin was cool and clear. Sunlight streamed through the tall pines, and a quiet calm hung over everything. Sandra sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, holding the letter she had found in the wooden box. She had read it 3 times through the night, but each time new emotions surfaced. Guilt, warmth, and something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Keanu came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Neither did you." He nodded, sitting beside her. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It felt safe. They both looked out at the forest, stretching endlessly before them. Finally, she spoke. "I read your note again, the one you left inside the box. You said this was never about what we lost. It was about what we kept." He nodded. "That's what I believe. But why did you keep it buried all these years?" He took a slow breath. "Because I didn't want it to become another Hollywood story. I didn't want what we had to be turned into gossip. I wanted it to stay pure, untouched." She smiled softly. "You always did protect the things that mattered most. And sometimes," he said, "that meant protecting them even from myself." Her eyes drifted toward the ring inside the box. The engraving, "For always." "Why that?" "Because I couldn't say forever," he replied. "Forever is uncertain. But for always means as long as we remember, as long as we care." She looked at him, her eyes full of quiet admiration. "You make everything sound simple," he chuckled softly. "It's only simple when it's true." She set her mug down and opened the letter again. "There's a part I still don't understand," she said. "You wrote, 'When you find what's missing, don't be afraid to return it.' What did you mean by that?" He hesitated. It wasn't about the gift. It was about time. The time we never gave ourselves to just be real with each other. She nodded slowly, feeling a lump in her throat. "I think I understand now." They sat quietly again, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Birds sang faintly in the distance. For a brief moment, it felt like the rest of the world had stopped. But then, Keanu's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression changing. Sandra noticed. "Bad news?" He hesitated. "A friend from work. One of the film crew from our last project. There was an accident." Her eyes widened. "Is he okay?" "He's in the hospital. Critical condition." She reached out and touched his hand. "You should go." He shook his head. "Not now. He'd want me to finish what I started here." "Keanu," she said softly, "you've always been there for everyone." Maybe this time, someone needs to be there for you. He looked at her, understanding the weight in her words. You mean you? He asked quietly. She smiled. Maybe it's time we both stop running from the people who truly understand us. He didn't reply, but his silence said enough. Later that afternoon, they walked by the lake near the cabin. The reflection of the sunlight danced across the water. Sandra picked up a stone and threw it across the surface, watching it skip 3 times before sinking. You remember? She said suddenly. The first movie premiere we went to? I was nervous. I didn't know how to act. And you told me, just be you. I thought it was silly advice then. But now, it's the only advice that makes sense. He smiled at the memory. I remember. You wore that silver dress. Everyone was looking at you, but you looked like you wanted to disappear. I did, she said, laughing softly. And then you walked over with that ridiculous bouquet of wildflowers and said, they're messy, but honest. He laughed too. They were the only ones left. No, she said, shaking her head. You chose them because they reminded you of something real. And that's what you've always done. Found meaning in the simplest things. He grew quiet, his expression turning serious again. Maybe that's why I held on to that promise for so long. Because deep down, I knew you were the only person who understood what real actually means. The wind blew through her hair as she looked at him. And what if I told you that I came here not just to keep a promise, but to make peace with something I never said? His eyes softened. Then I'd listen. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling. When I said I was sick, I wasn't completely honest. It's not just a small illness. It's something that might change everything. I didn't want pity, Keanu. I just wanted to feel normal again, at least with you. His heart dropped. He turned toward her, his voice low but steady. What are you saying? I've been diagnosed with a condition, she said carefully. It's rare. It affects my nerves, my balance. It's slow, but it's there. And I don't know how much time I have before it gets worse. He felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, anything. But all he could do was take her hand. You didn't tell anyone? Not yet, she said. I didn't want it to define me. I didn't want it to change how people looked at me. But I couldn't keep it from you. Not after that promise. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for trusting me. I didn't want to face it alone, she whispered. You won't, he said firmly. Not now, not ever. A tear rolled down her cheek, and for the first time in years, she didn't hide it. He brushed it away gently, and in that quiet moment, neither fame nor fear existed, only 2 people who had finally stopped pretending that life waited for anyone. As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Sandra looked at him and said softly, So this is what the gift really was. Not a key, not a ring, not a box. It was time, the one thing we both kept giving away to everything else. Keanu nodded. And now we're finally giving it to each other. They stood there in silence, holding on to the moment as if it might vanish with the wind. The promise reborn, the morning after their talk by the lake was slow and soft. Fog drifted gently between the pine trees, wrapping the cabin in a calm silence. Sandra woke before dawn, sitting near the window with a cup of tea. She watched the first light spill across the mountains, her thoughts heavy yet peaceful. She had spoken her truth, the one she had hidden for months, and instead of pity, she had found something far more powerful: understanding. When Keanu stepped into the room, still half asleep, she smiled. You're not much of a morning person, are you? He chuckled, rubbing his eyes. Depends on who I'm waking up for. She looked at him, her eyes soft. You used to say that on set, too. Yeah, he said, sitting beside her. Back then, I thought mornings were meant for running to catch up. Now I think they're meant for slowing down. She nodded, sipping her tea. Maybe that's the lesson life gives us when we stop pretending it lasts forever. He watched her for a moment. There was a fragility in her presence now, but also a strange strength, like someone who had finally stopped fighting the storm and learned to dance in the rain. Do you remember? She said after a long pause. When we wrapped our second movie together and you disappeared for a month? He smiled faintly. I went to Japan. I needed to clear my head. And when you came back, she continued, You told me you'd found peace sitting alone under a cherry blossom tree. He nodded. I remember. I told you it reminded me that beauty fades. And that's okay. She sighed softly. I never understood what you meant until now. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in the quiet hum of the morning. Then Keanu stood up suddenly. Come with me, he said. Where? You'll see. He led her outside, down a narrow path behind the cabin that wound through the woods. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and the smell of wet pine filled the air. After a few minutes, they reached a small clearing with a single tree in the center, tall, strong, and covered with white blossoms. You planted this? She asked, awe in her voice. He nodded. The year we finished the lake house. It was one of the hardest years of my life. But this tree reminded me that endings can become beginnings. She touched the bark gently. It's beautiful, he smiled. Every spring it blooms brighter, even when the winters are harsh. She looked at him knowingly, like people. He didn't answer, but his expression said everything. Then she noticed something carved into the wood. Faint but clear. 2 initials, K and S. You did this? She asked softly. He nodded. I didn't think anyone would ever see it. It was just something I needed to do. And now I'm seeing it, she said. And that makes it complete, he replied. The wind blew gently through the clearing, scattering a few petals across the ground. Sandra caught one and held it between her fingers. Keanu, she said quietly, what if this is our story's real ending? Not the sad one, the peaceful one. He looked at her, a flicker of pain crossing his face. You're talking like it's over. No, she said, shaking her head. I'm talking like it's finally real. We've spent years hiding behind work, schedules, and silence. Now we're just us, and that's enough. He nodded slowly. Then let's make it count. How? She asked. He smiled faintly. By turning the promise into something living. She tilted her head, confused. What do you mean? This place, he said, looking around. It's always been my escape. But it doesn't have to be just mine anymore. I want to turn it into something good. A quiet retreat. A space for people who need peace, who need to remember that kindness still matters. She blinked, taken aback. You're serious? Completely, he said. You once told me the best gifts are the ones that keep giving. Maybe this can be that, our shared gift to the world. She smiled through tears. You really think people would come? He nodded. Not for fame, not for us, but for what it represents. Silence, hope, second chances. Her voice trembled slightly. And what would you call it? He thought for a moment, then whispered, For always. She closed her eyes as the meaning sank in, the same words engraved on the ring, the same phrase that had followed them through years of distance and silence. For always, she repeated softly. I like that. They spent the next few hours walking through the land, imagining what it could become. Small cabins near the trees, a garden by the lake, a place for artists and dreamers to heal quietly. For once, they weren't thinking about scripts or fame or awards, only about what they could build that would outlast them both. But later that evening, when the sun began to sink, Sandra grew quiet again. She sat by the piano inside the cabin, fingers hovering over the keys. Keanu watched her from the doorway. Play something, he said. She hesitated. It's been years. Then let the years out, he replied. She smiled faintly and began to play. The melody was soft and uncertain at first, but soon it found its rhythm, tender, emotional, full of longing. Halfway through, her hands trembled and she stopped, lowering her head. Keanu walked over, placing his hand on hers. You okay? It's just hard, she whispered. My fingers feel weaker every week. His jaw tightened. We'll find a way to make it better. She looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. You can't fix this, he nodded slowly. Maybe not, but I can make every day you have left brighter. She smiled faintly. You already have. He leaned against the piano, listening to the silence that followed. You know, he said quietly, I used to think gifts were about what you could hold in your hands. But now I see The best ones are what you give without expecting anything back. She looked at him lovingly. And that's what makes you who you are, Keanu. You give without ever asking. He shrugged softly. Maybe that's why I never stopped believing in our promise. The night fell slowly. The air grew colder, and as the last note from the piano faded into silence, both of them knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the rebirth of it, because the greatest gift they had ever shared wasn't fame or success or memory. It was time, kindness, and the courage to start again. The storm before the calm, the days that followed, were peaceful at first. Sandra and Keanu spent their mornings walking by the lake and their evenings planning the retreat they wanted to build together. They talked about cabins, about art studios, about creating a place where people could breathe again. It was simple. It was quiet, and it was the happiest either of them had been in years. But beneath the calm, there was something unspoken, a shadow that neither of them wanted to name. Sandra's illness was advancing faster than she let on. Some mornings, her hands shook so much that holding her cup of tea became a struggle. Other times, her balance faltered when she stood too quickly. She hid it as best as she could, but Keanu noticed. He always noticed. One morning, he found her sitting on the porch steps, pale and breathing heavily. Her fingers clutched the wooden railing, her eyes unfocused. He rushed over, his voice trembling. "Sandra, what's wrong?" She smiled weakly. "Just dizzy. It comes and goes." He knelt beside her. "We're going to a doctor. Now." She shook her head gently. "Keanu, please. We talked about this. I don't want hospitals. Not now. Not when we finally have peace." He took her hand, desperate. "Peace doesn't mean giving up." "No," she whispered. "It means accepting what is." He looked away, struggling to hold his emotions. "You shouldn't have to accept this alone." "I'm not alone," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "I have you." Those words hit him like a wave, comforting and crushing at once. Later that day, a heavy rain began to fall over the mountains. Dark clouds rolled in and thunder echoed through the valley. They stayed inside the cabin, the sound of rain drumming against the windows like an old rhythm they both knew too well. Keanu lit a fire in the fireplace while Sandra sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch. She was staring into the flames, her thoughts miles away. "You're quiet," he said softly. "I was just thinking," she replied, "about how strange life is. How it gives you everything when you stop chasing it." He smiled faintly. "You always did find beauty in endings," she turned to him. "Because they make us pay attention. If every day was easy, we'd forget what matters." He sat beside her, nodding. "And what matters most to you now?" She looked at him without hesitation. "This right now. Being here with you." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside, and the air between them grew heavy with emotion. After a while, Sandra reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver key he had given her weeks ago. She held it in her trembling hand and said, "I think I finally understand what this was meant for." "Tell me," he whispered. "You gave me this key," she said slowly, "to remind me that some doors stay closed until we're brave enough to open them. And I think this one was about forgiveness. Not for you, not for me, but for the time we lost." Keanu's eyes softened. "We did lose a lot of time." "Maybe," she said, smiling faintly. "But we found something better. Truth." He nodded quietly, his voice low. "And peace." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a few minutes they simply listened to the rain. But then, as lightning flashed outside, Sandra flinched, her body suddenly stiff. Keanu turned, alarmed. "Sandra?" Her breathing grew shallow, and she clutched her chest, eyes wide. Panic filled his face as he held her close. Hey, look at me!" "Breathe. It's okay." "You're okay," she gasped weakly, shaking her head. "Keanu, promise me something." "Don't talk like that," he said, tears starting to form. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me that you'll finish what we started, that the retreat will happen, even if I'm not here to see it." He shook his head desperately. "You're going to be here. We're doing this together." Her hand brushed his cheek. "You always believed in hope. Now let me believe in you." And with that, she closed her eyes, her body trembling. Keanu held her tightly, his heart pounding as thunder crashed outside. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Minutes, hours, maybe more, until her breathing steadied again. He exhaled, tears falling freely now. "You scared me," he whispered. Her eyes opened slowly, weak but alive. "Then promise me you won't stop living after I'm gone." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I promise you this, I'll live twice as much. Once for me, once for you," she smiled faintly. "That's the Keanu I remember." The storm outside began to fade. The thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving only the soft rhythm of rain on the roof. Keanu carried her to bed, staying beside her until she fell asleep. He watched her breathing, memorizing every detail, the rise and fall of her chest, the faint smile still resting on her lips. Hours later, when the sun rose again, the sky was clear. Birds sang in the trees and everything felt fresh, renewed. Sandra was still asleep, peaceful and still. Keanu quietly stepped outside, the air cool against his skin. He walked to the cherry blossom tree they had visited and stood beneath it, looking up at the branches. Soft petals fell, landing in his hair and on his shoulders. He whispered to the wind, "We'll finish what we started." The promise was no longer between two friends. It was between a man and the memory of the one person who had reminded him what true kindness meant. And in that moment, Keanu understood that love wasn't measured in years, but in the moments that make us human, the quiet ones, the real ones, the ones that stay. The gift that never ends weeks passed since that stormy night at the cabin. The skies over the valley had cleared. The lake shimmered in the sunlight again, and the world seemed to move forward as if nothing had changed. But for Keanu, everything had changed. Sandra's condition grew unpredictable. Some days she was strong, walking by the lake, laughing at old jokes, teasing him about his quiet nature. Other days, she barely had the strength to get out of bed. Yet through it all, she never lost her calm. Her eyes always carried the same gentle peace, the kind that comes from someone who has made peace with the world and with herself.